Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ann Albert. I'm the Clapp Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I am welcoming everyone now to the second lecture in our series on archaeology and ancient Jewish life. This is a new series that the Katz Center is presenting this year in partnership very proudly and gratefully with the Penn Museum. This is a partnership between two historic institutions and two of Penn's most illustrious ones that are both part of this wider community, and we're very happy to be doing it. So I want to start out by saying, if you have found us and come to us today through the Penn Museum, I especially want to welcome you to the Katz Center's orbit and let you know that we offer a wide range of Zoom programs on Jewish studies and Jewish history topics every year. We are nearing the end of this year's programming, but we do have one more talk in this archaeology series in a month's time, which you probably already know about if you registered for this one. And we have a special mini course available. That's 3 weeks in a small group with Professor Yonatan Brafman, delving into how halacha or Jewish law has been transformed in modernity. There's information about that on our website. And one more program coming up that's really exciting and really special that I want to flag, which is that Professor Barak Medina will be giving the first annual Howard J. Ryder Memorial Lecture next week, a week from today, March 29th at 5:15 p.m. This is something that's accessible in person. It's held at Penn's Law School or on Zoom. So if you're coming to us from far away, you can still attend. He'll be speaking on the topic Israel's Rights Revolution, Public Opinion and Constitutional Law, about how after a constitutional revolution during the 1990s, Israel's now facing a counter-constitutional revolution at a time of profound challenge to democratic governance and constitutionalism globally. So he'll explore these changes and look at Israel's process of constitution making and clarifying the complex interactions of public opinion, the Supreme Court, and the government in Israel. So I imagine this is going to stimulate wide interest, and it dovetails really nicely also with the series that we held for much of this year on intersections of Jewish law and American constitutional law. So if those are your interests, you can find all of the details online, and I think there are links being populated in your chat right now. Just to say also, you can find those past programs, all of those programs on constitutional law and others, also including this year's series on the history of Jewish Messianism, on the Katz Center's YouTube channel, as this one will be located as well within about a week. So if you missed something or want to share it with others, you can find it online. And if you're watching online on YouTube right now, then hello to you too. For those of us who are with us in real time, as we proceed, I do invite you to participate in the Q&A that we'll hold after the initial presentation. So you can submit questions anytime throughout the hour using the Q&A function in the bottom of your Zoom window. So not the chat, but Q&A, and I will moderate that discussion. Lastly, before I introduce the speaker, I must, as always, thank the Klatt family and the Harry Stern Family Foundation, whose gifts funded public programs such as this one here at the center, and also the Katz family and the rest of our board of advisors and the many other donors who support the center and have supported the center. Thanks too to the leadership and staff of the Katz Center, including our director and associate director, Steve Weitzman and Natalie Dorman, Diana Dennis Walters, Brian Lipscomb, and Miriam Saperstein, who work behind the scenes. All right, now with no further ado, moving on to today's exciting topic. Hello, Simcha. I will introduce Simcha Gross. He is assistant professor of ancient rabbinics here at Penn. We're very, very lucky to have you. And Simcha is a specialist in ancient and early medieval Jewish history with a particular focus on the contextual study of the rabbis and rabbinic literature in their Persian and Islamic contexts, and also with a specialization in the study of Syriac Christianity. Professor Gross's latest project centers on the formative aspects of Sasanian imperialism on Babylonian Jewish society and culture. So we may find some elements of that focus in today's talk. And you can look for that book project to come out, I think this year, is that right? Yeah, should come out, will come out this year, from Cambridge University Press, called Babylonian Jews and Sasanian Imperialism in Late Antiquity. Of course, we should note he's also already the editor and co-author of several other works, notable among them the special issue of the Jewish Studies Quarterly coming out this year on the making of the rabbinic past, which I think is eagerly anticipated, and a volume of essays on Jews and Syriac Christians across the first millennium, many other things. I will note also that in addition to these accomplishments, before coming to Penn, Simcha taught at UC Irvine and at Stanford. This year, he is on leave from Penn with a Mellon Fellowship at the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he has also been awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellowship. All of these pale in comparison, obviously, to the distinction of having served as a fellow here at the Cat Center just last year, and also having received a Cat Center research grant together with Rivka Elitzur-Lehman to study these very incantation bowls that we'll hear about over at the Penn Museum last summer. So without taking any more of your time, Simcha, please go ahead. We're so happy to have you.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Thanks to the Cat Center, to the Penn Museum for putting together a wonderful series, especially to Anne and Diana, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. I'll dive right in. We have a lot to get to. We're going to talk today about an object and period that's near and dear to my heart, the incantation bowls, and what they have to say about Jewish society and culture at a particularly interesting historical moment. Our outline for today, I'll begin with a brief history of the discovery of the bowls and how they arrived, or how many of them arrived at Penn. We will then move to a description of what the incantation bowls are, how they work, then move to how historians and scholars have generally made use of the incantation bowls to better understand Jewish history. And then finally, I'll conclude by describing the work we did this past summer and the work we intend to do going forward on the incantation bowls in the Penn collection. And just to quickly situate us geographically and chronologically, I hope you can see my mouse, but we will be in what is today central Iraq, and we will more or less be within the period of the 5th to the 7th century CE. Okay, so just a brief history of the discovery of the bowls and the Penn collection. The story of the bowls, the modern story of the bowls, really begins in the 1840s and 50s. The first major work on them is by Austin Henry Layard in 1853. This is during a period that we might call Mesopotamia mania. Mesopotamia and its discoveries are of huge excitement across the world, especially in the British Empire, and excavations are followed rapidly by British audiences, as are the antiques that make their way back into England. Henry Layard, he publishes Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon in 1853. And in there, he describes first the purchase of 2 incantation bowls about 10 years prior by the British Museum. Those are the first incantation bowls that we know of to make it to a major museum, though they were not discovered in situ. That is, we do not know when exactly they were discovered. They were sold to the British Museum. And so this work that you see here is really the first to describe the discovery of incantation bowls on site. It publishes as well 7 incantation bowls, 5 in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic and 2 in Syriac. I'll describe what those terms mean in a moment. And these are transcribed and translated by Thomas Ellis, a scholar of Hebrew. His transcriptions and translations were not very good, and they have since been patched up quite a bit. He also had quite a dim view of these objects. If you look to the right here, he's describing these incantations and says, clearly that Jews were corrupted by the idolatry and superstitions of the Babylonians. This dim view of the incantations will more or less stay with them for much of their early history, which is why in some ways they are understudied, which is a benefit to us because there's a lot more still to do with them. Okay, so that's 1853. This book is published. In the intervening decades, a couple more incantation bowls are published in various academic journals. And then in 1888, the Penn Museum, in collaboration with, with the permission of the Ottoman Sultan, have a major excavation in the city of Nippur, modern Nufar. And there are multiple dig seasons up through the year 1900, and then again, a short while thereafter. These archaeologists were primarily interested in the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia, again, Mesopotamia mania, but they have to dig through certain other archaeological strata to arrive at the periods that they are interested in. And so as they're going, as we'll see, they eventually encounter our objects. One of the things they discover, and one of the reasons they're so excited about this city, is it's the site of many ancient Mesopotamian temples. Thousands of tablets are discovered there. Interestingly, in the very same site in which the incantation bowls will be discovered, they also discover an archive of tablets, as you see here, one of them, which describes, among other things, the financial activity of Jews in the city and in the region. So we, from the 6th century BCE, I should say, right after the exile, the Babylonian exile of 586 BCE. So we basically have about 1,000 years gap between the first evidence of Jews in this site and then the next evidence of Jews in the site, which is remarkable. As they're digging, they come upon hundreds and hundreds of these incantation bowls. You see here one of the early pictures of the bowls. They were discovered face down in the remains of homes. The early archaeologists also suggest that some of them were discovered in graves. This is possible, but for the most part, they were discovered in homes. They're mostly in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. That is, they are written in what we would call Hebrew or box script. And again, they're found mainly in this late Sasanian period. So they're typically dated to roughly the 5th to 7th century CE. Even though they're discovered already in 1888, and we hear about them in the works of the early archaeologists in the subsequent years, it takes roughly 20 years until they are made public by James Montgomery, who is a professor of Hebrew and Aramaic at Penn at the time. And he publishes his monumental Aramaic incantation text from Nippur in 1913, published by the Penn Museum Press. It's the first scholarly editions of the bowls. It remains the benchmark for all subsequent editions. He publishes 40 bowls from the collection, and he himself admits that there are over 150 other bowls in the collection, which were given as a gift by the Sultan of Turkey, who nonetheless preserved the best specimens for himself. Do with that what you will. Since Montgomery's edition in 1913, there have been many, many more discoveries. There are more collections that we know of, both private and public, and many, many more additions. As a result, the estimate now is that there are roughly 2,500 known bowls, of which roughly 600 have been published thus far. So there's a lot more still to do. Okay, so that's just kind of a brief history of their discovery. What are the incantation bowls? So on a kind of basic level, they are on plain terracotta ceramic. They have incantations that spiral from the inside outward. These are very nice examples of that. They have scribal hands of various talents. Different scribes are more skilled or less skilled. Some of them are very, very readable and legible. Others are terribly difficult to read. And scholars are now beginning to wonder, does that reflect different training, different social positions, and so on. And lastly, many of them have an image of a demon, which you see here below, though notice above that you don't have a demon there. And so none of these are all kind of general rules of thumb, but none apply universally to all bowls. The art of the bowls is a subject that needs further work. Thus far, basically one of the only scholars to work on this seriously is Nama Velazhny, who also produced these images from various incantation bowls. And as you can see from them, typically demons are bound, right? You don't just show a demon on these bowls, you also have to bind them, enchain them. So you'll notice that most of them have some kind of chain that binds them together. One might argue that this circle is binding what is almost certainly Lilith, the demon, and people have argued that this is in fact not a demon, but a sorcerer, because the figure is not bound. Again, while these are generalizations, there are all sorts of unusual incantation and amulets from these same sites. For instance, we know of roughly 5 skulls with Jewish, Babylonian, Aramaic incantations. These incantations are, to the extent that they're legible, indistinguishable from what we find on the incantation bowls. That is, they are the same exact incantations, same family of incantations, but on an entirely different item. We can discuss why scholars think some people might have done this. There are eggshells. Unfortunately, most of these, we have the fragments. That the one you're looking at is actually from the pen collection, which I worked on a little bit this summer with Rivka. But they're broken, unsurprisingly, and so it's kind of difficult to make out the writing on them. And then lastly, if most bowls are what we might say are cereal bowls, there are a few salad bowls, that is just massive in size and scale bowls with incantations on them. The incantations themselves are not necessarily any different from what we find on the cereal bowls. And again, these were overturned or discovered overturned. This was useful for us because it preserved the writing and insulated it from climate and so on. The theory is that these might have functioned as kind of overturned demon traps. So you draw the demon and you turn it over, and that practice is how you kind of lock the demon. This is a theory. No bowl describes this practice exactly. No text describes it exactly. So this is kind of our working hypothesis. Interestingly, several bowls include a description or an instruction on the outside where to place them. So this one, for instance, says Baba Bara, the outside door. And so they're regularly placed in entrances of rooms and so on to ward the demons off from entering. And this should already signal to some people that this is in part of a kind of family of Jewish amulets, or amulets in general, which tend to ward things off at the entrance. For instance, the mezuzah, which of course in rabbinic text already are understood to be a form of amulet. And you see here a medieval sample from the Cairo Geniza, which also includes angel names and all sorts of other properties typical of incantations. Okay, so now let's get to the actual incantations on the bowls, not just the item itself. They appear the incantations appear in 3 different scripts, which are also 3 different dialects of Eastern Aramaic. There's Jewish Babylonian Aramaic to the left. This is the one that'll interest us most today. These are also by far the most numerous of the bowls by quite a margin. We then have Mandaic bowls. There are a decent amount of these as well. The Mandaeans were a community who lived primarily in southern Iraq and emerged in precisely this same period. In fact, these are probably the earliest Mandaic writings that we have, in Mandaic script at least. We can discuss them. They're fascinating, but for another time. And then lastly, we have Syriac text in Syriac. This is typically the script and language spoken by Aramaic-speaking Christians through Syria and Iraq and so on. On these incantations, and this is true of all 3 incantation types, all 3 scripts, you have a client's name with family members. So if a bowl was written for me, that is, I'm the client and my name would be on the bowl typically. You would have angels and powerful invocations, verses, names, deities, and so on. These are the things you are invoking to defend you, to protect you, or to do other requests you may have, and we'll see what those other requests might be. There are the malevolent forces, demons of various names and types. These are typically the forces you are trying to keep away. There are historiolae. These are stories or precedents that you cite as a paradigm that you therefore try to invoke in the present. So you might say something like, just as Moses did X, or you describe what Moses did, and the attempt is to make that same action occur in the present. You have standard verbs, things like heal, bind, ban, divorce, which is particularly prominent and interesting, that you divorce demons. There's one bowl that even describes divorcing in the manner in which demons divorce each other. So they're also getting divorced. Demons, I should note, in general, are agents. They have subjectivity. They are able to behave on their own and independently. And so these kind of different actions and ways of attracting or fending off demons and angels show that these beings are considered to have some amount of autonomy. Okay, so use these various verbs to, do something to these demons or angels. And then lastly, you have what are known as voces magicae. These are names and sounds that don't necessarily spell anything out, but seem to have had some kind of power, and characteres or symbols. And you see some of them on this bowl here, particularly there, right? So these are just kind of symbols that, again, seem to have had some kind of ritual power. These are true of all incantations, but there are different types of incantations that serve different functions, and each of them kind of have specialized formula, particular verbs that they tend to use, particular imagery, angels and demons that they discuss, and so on. And we'll look at now a few examples of the types of incantations that appear on these bowls. So first, we won't read all this, don't worry. Just to kind of give you a sense of what a typical bowl looks like, and I've color-coded it schematically just to give you a sense of these different elements that we itemized above. So this is a bowl for protection in the Penn collection. These are the most common, these for kind of generic protection against demonic forces. And so I'll just read a little bit of it. Healing from heaven, that's a very standard beginning. For Dadbe, son of Asmanduch, and for Sarkoi, daughter of Dada, his wife. These are our clients and their sons and their daughters and their house and their property, right? This is the household that is being protected by this bowl. You then talk about the demons and devils and all these bad forces. Notice that kind of this plurality, you kind of want to invoke as many different things as possible to ward them all off. You adjure all of the angels to help you, or various kinds of angels to help you. And here we have the invocation of a particular angel which descended from heaven, blah, blah, blah. Again, this angel should fend off these malevolent forces. We repeat our client for whom the bowl is protection. And we end with, in the name of God, Amen, Amen, Selah, and a verse from Psalms. Just to give you a sense of distribution in terms of the colors, this is another bowl for protection, and just notice that the kind of distribution of client angelic forces or powerful invocations, malevolent forces are different, right? So there's quite a bit of fluidity in the way any scribe might have realized a particular incantation. So if protection are the most common forms of incantation, we have all sorts of other incantations tested in the bowls. For instance, we have curse bowls. These are what we might call aggressive magic, and they're exactly what they sound like. You are cursing your enemy, antagonist, and they use particular imagery, right? You send against, not protecting from, but sending against this person's enemy. Your jailers and your masters release dogs from leeches and cubs from chains, inflame and burn him, punishment and heat him. Right, you talk about, may there be no remedy for him and no release forever. You invoke the great day of judgment against him, right? So when you dislike somebody, find a scribe who will write you a curse bowl. If you have curse bowls, we should think of this as an economy. Just as you might curse somebody, you might want to be protected from someone's curses. And so we also have counter curse bowls. And these are fascinatingly found oftentimes bound by two copies of the same bowl in bitumen, bound by bitumen, and it's meant to imitate the action described on the bowl itself, the incantation itself, which is to overturn the curse and send it back. And so I'll just read, for your namesake, blah, blah, blah. This is to overturn and to send and to return against the person who he thinks cursed him, send against her dogs. And remember, right, one of the things you do in a curse bowl is you might release dogs from leashes against your enemy. And so here you're returning everything, and you also send against them the same forces. So if we have curse bowls and counter curse bowls, we have love magic. Love is itself an aggressive magic. You're using a bowl to cause a reaction in another person. And love is clearly here conceived of as a fiery force within you. And so you say, may this person be inflamed and kindled and burn after me. You talk about hot herbs and peppers, and may they be inflamed and burned by them. And then you invoke the angel Rachmiel, which means the angel Loviel, and the name of Glibat, the passionate, right? So you are particularly invoking angels who can help you, in this case, Loviel, presumably a kind of angel of love. If you have love incantations, you also have anti-love, right? Take away this person's unwanted attention from me. So may this Gushnin be turned away from Namoi. And here the imagery is parting, right? Keep them apart from us. Just as the living may be turned away from the dead and the dead from the living, so will I be turned away from this person. Again, just as the dead do not approach the living, turn the face of this Gushnin from Namoi. And here you invoke the angel Hafriel, which means to overturn, right? So this angel is clearly responsible for taking away someone's attention, turning it away. And then you have a great verse, which is also, I guess, a kind of historiola, where you invoke how God came between, or the angel of God came between the camp of Israel and the camp of Egypt, keeping them apart. And so here you see how cleverly some scribes might invoke particular verses to mimic the action that they desire in the present. Again, curse, counter curse, love, anti-love. We have bowls for business success, not very many, but we have a few. Here's one of them for the prosperity of Wartan, son of Mirai, and for the coming to him of men and women, Jews and Gentiles, strangers and relatives, honest and dishonest, slaves, male and female servants, and so on. May they come and have some kind of business exchange with him. And so notice here again how you try to cover all of your bases: Jew, Gentile, every single kind, honest, dishonest, all people just come bring business to Wartan. My students never fail to notice that it can't be chance that our bowl for business success, the client is named Warden, as in the School of Warden. Okay, so these are kind of our various kinds of bowls: protection, curse, love, business. We also have some bowls that don't have clients on them and just seem to be powerful invocations. Here's one really fascinating example, which is just the Shema, one of the most important Jewish prayers to the present. And here you can tell that this is not just citing Deuteronomy 6, but is in fact citing the Shema as a liturgical prayer, because it includes the line, blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto L'Olam Va'ed, right, which is not in the Bible, but only in the liturgy. So here we're citing this very important liturgical prayer as an effective invocation against, for protection, presumably. The Shema is well known to us, but there are all sorts of ways in which biblical verses and only biblical verses are cited. And here's just one example I've been looking at recently, where you can see how scribes would creatively combine things from, if you go by the division of the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, the writings, the Bible, and prophets, all in one bowl. We've only discussed legible incantation bowls. There are a variety of, and quite a lot of, what are known as pseudoscript bowls. The estimates are between 20 to 30% of all collections. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a bit higher. These are have writing on them. You can see here, they kind of look like writing to you, but they do not in fact spell anything out. There is no legible text here. The question, of course, is, so then what are they doing? How do they work? And we will return to that later. But that's more or less the kind of variety of incantations that you find on these bowls. So to summarize what we kind of can derive broadly from these incantations, they attest a kind of shared late antique Babylonian cosmology. There's the cosmos, which is teeming with powerful forces, good, evil, neutral. Ills are often caused by malevolent forces, right? If you're sick, this might be because there's a demon in your house. Sometimes this might be deployed by a foe, like a curse bowl. Your goal is to counteract and subdue them with various kinds of formulae and practices, and you marshal other forces in that effort: angels, gods, powers, and so on. And so incantations are essentially one way to attempt to control one's surroundings. We should think about what this might have been like on an experiential level for your average Jew, Syriac Christian, Mandaean in Babylonia, right? When you're walking through your day and you don't feel well, why don't you feel well? Is that a demon? Was that an enemy's curse? Why are you in love? Is that a real feeling? Is that an incantation? Why are you successful or unsuccessful in business, right? And all this leads us to realize that proper knowledge of the cosmos and how to effectively exploit it to your ends is a real kind of power. And so the scribes responsible for these incantations would undoubtedly have been very, very prominent figures. And this is one of the questions that we'll return to it shortly, kind of who are these scribes and where do they sit within the larger social landscape of late antique Babylonian communities. Okay, so we've discussed the history of the bowls and what incantations are. I just kind of want to give a general survey of the kinds of things scholars do with the bowls to better understand Jewish history. And to understand this, you have to kind of take a step back and realize that despite the importance of this period, this is the period, right, the Sasanian period is a period in which the Babylonian rabbis flourish in Iraq. It's when the Babylonian Talmud is formed. This is a text that will come to shape Jewish practice and belief to the present. And yet we don't really have that much data about the Jews of this place and period, right? We have the Babylonian Talmud. We have roughly 24 Jewish Sasanian seals. As you can see, they give you very minimal evidence or data to work with, though I think there's some kinds of interesting stories you might be able to tell with them. And we have essentially one other archaeological find, material evidence for Jews in Iraq in late antiquity, broadly defined, and that's a synagogue discovered at Dura Europos, which was abandoned in 256 CE. So, centuries before we think the incantation bowls are first used. So we have very minimal evidence, and therefore, in some ways, both because of how rich the bowls are, but also out of desperation, we need to use them to try to tell stories about the Jews of Iraq. And so what scholars have essentially done is the following. These are broadly the kinds of approaches scholars have taken. I won't focus on the first one, but a major area of study historically with the incantation bowls from the first ones published in 1853 until today is the linguistic study of Eastern Aramaic dialects. And again, I'm happy to direct people to work on these subjects. We're going to focus more on the social, religious, and cultural history that scholars have performed with the bowls. And we'll begin with the first four, just to give you a quick taste, and then we'll dive a bit deeper into the other. So first, on the history of liturgy, social history, history of Jewish mysticism, of so-called Jewish magic. Scholars have done all sorts of things with the bowls. They provide amazing evidence. Just to give you one taste of each of these, on the top left of your screen, you see a fascinating, very well-known example from the incantation bowls. On your left, the incantation bowls regularly have a formula that's often called angels all around me. There's an angel above and to my left and to my right and below and so on. As common as it is in the bowls, it makes its way in the 8th and 9th century into the first rabbinic liturgical handbooks, where it is a prayer that you are supposed to recite before going to sleep to protect you as you sleep. I put the arrows here to show that in general, one of the things scholars try to do is understand the directionality of the relationship between liturgical formula that appear in later rabbinic documents and when they appear on the bowls, which came first, right? Did they originate in kind of the world of incantations and migrate into liturgy, or vice versa? It also is a good reminder that the very division between incantation and liturgy is a modern one, and that to many ancients, there might not have been that much of a distinction between them. On the right, one of the, I think, areas of much needed research is demography and household patterns, gender norms, and so on from the incantation bowls. And just to give one particularly wonderful example, while most of the bowls, when they attest some kind of cohabiting relationship, it is monogamous, we do have polygamous relationships in the incantation bowls. And here's just one example of a man with, it seems, 3 wives and children from each of them. And so what happens if we collect all the data about clients? What can we do with that? And we'll see a bit more about this in a moment. There's the history of Jewish magic itself as a subject. We have incantations and amulets, Jewish amulets from the 7th century BCE to the 7th century CE and on, of course, but just for our period. And how do the bowls both represent continuity in those practices, and how does it represent discontinuity or cultural specificity of its own time and place? And so this is a thing we might study. And then lastly, again, like liturgy, Jewish mysticism, these texts for the most part are only composed, written down, and appear to us in the medieval period. But we find fragments of these works, or at least ideas that are very redolent with Jewish kind of standard Jewish mystical formulae in the incantation bowl. So once again, what's the relationship between what we find in the bowls and what we find in the later works? Okay. One subject that I'll spend a little bit more time on is interreligious contact. Again, given how limited our evidence is, if you judge by the Talmud, you might decide that there is little interreligious contact in late antique Babylonia, but maybe the incantation bowls offer different evidence, and indeed they do. Just to give you a few tastes and example, these are 4 incantation bowls in the Penn collection. If you see on the bottom here, this is a picture that I took when my students and I looked at these 4 bowls in person. And it's for the same client, a client by the name of Dadbe bar Asmanducht, who has 4 incantation bowls composed for him, 2 in Syriac and 2 in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. This seems to suggest that the very same client might go to both a Jewish scribe and a Syriac Christian scribe. We might question those assumptions. Maybe a Jewish scribe could write in Syriac, maybe a Syriac Christian scribe could write in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, but that itself might suggest a certain amount of contact and crossover as well. Many of the clients named in the bowls, in the Jewish Babylonian Aramaic bowls, have Persian or Zoroastrian theophoric names. That is, they have the names of deities of Iranian deities, Persian Zoroastrian deities. Just to give you some examples, here you have Yezidad bar Yazdan Ducht, or God-given daughter of son of daughter of the gods. Right, and so what is the identity of this client? Is this a Jew who is acculturated, let's say like an American Jew with the name Christine, or is this a Zoroastrian who is patronizing Jewish scribes in the same way that Dadbe may have patronized a Jewish and a Syriac Christian scribe? And that's a question that we don't really have resolution for, but we debate quite a bit. There are other kind of more secure cases. For instance, Christian names. Here you see one bowl has daughter of Sunday. This isn't a name that there'd be any reason for a Jew to use, whose siblings are Grigor and Miriam, or Gregory and Mary. This seems to be a Christian client with a bowl in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic script. There are other clients with Christian names like Mat Yeshu, maidservant of Jesus. We also have pagan names like Baal, son of Nanai. But again, here you see the problems with making any kind of assumptions about their identity, because we also have a Judah bar Nanai, that is a good Jewish first name, who is the son of what we might call a pagan name. And so, again, we are constantly trying to understand the identities of these various kinds of scribes based on their names. There's context described in the bowls. We already saw this bowl. This is the bowl for business success, which, of course, in its list of potential financial opportunities, mentions both Jews and Gentiles. Presumably, this might be understood to reflect the genuine desire of a businessman who has interactions with both Jews and non-Jews, and not exclusively with Jews. We now can get to a bit of the more exciting evidence. We have evidence of Jewish motifs in Syriac bowls. We have a rabbi divorcing demons in Syriac. This is Rev Joshua bar Parachia. He is a rabbi who is known from rabbinic literature. He appears in a handful of Syriac bowls and dozens of Jewish Babylonian Aramaic bowls. So what is this rabbi doing in Syriac bowls? And is it coincidence that this rabbi is identified by the Babylonian Talmud as Jesus's rabbi? So Do the Syriac Christian scribes know this? Do they know these stories that Jews are telling about their own rabbinic figures and therefore think, I want to adopt this story, this rabbi is useful for our purposes too? Maybe rabbis can become non-denominational, or maybe we should think about incantations as a kind of ancient medicine. And so you can transfer medicine across groups because they're universal and they aren't kind of confessionally bound in the ways that we might think of typically. If we have Rabbi Joshua ben Parachia in a Syriac bowl, perhaps most famously, we have Jesus named and invoked in a Jewish Babylonian Aramaic bowl. This is on the bottom here, by the name of Jesus, who conquered the height and the depth of his cross, and by the name of his exalted Father, and by the name of the Holy Spirits forever and eternity. It's a fascinating bowl that invokes all sorts of other kinds of traditions, some of them Zoroastrian, some of them biblical, and again, explicitly Christian at the end. And so we might again ask, what's the identity of this scribe? What's the identity of this client? And why are they invoking all these different traditions in the same bowl, and ending, of course, with Jesus? So again, just kind of as one of the areas of study, you can argue that the incantation bowls offer a rather different portrait of interreligious contact in late antique Iraq than the Talmud, right? According to the incantation bowls, it might not be all that uncommon at all. And in fact, if you collect all of the evidence for interreligious contact, including in Syriac sources, it seems to have been, in fact, a rather common affair. And that leads us to therefore understand the Talmud differently as selectively describing certain kinds of encounters and not others. That is, the Talmud is an ideological text, and this helps us reveal what its ideological choices of representation are. Okay, so if that's interreligious contact, we learn other things about Babylonian Jewish history. I'll be very brief here. In essence, early scholars used to divide between the world of the rabbis and the world of the incantation bowls. The bowls, of course, represent the uneducated masses or popular religion, whereas the rabbis represent the scholastic elites with little or no connection to the masses, and therefore the bowls and the Talmud represent entirely different worlds. And we've now moved well beyond this. This is kind of one of the exciting areas of research. With ever-increasing publications, it's clear that rabbis and rabbinic literature are present in many incantation bowls. We even can begin to argue, as Avigail Manniken-Bamberger and I have argued in print, that certain scribes preferred rabbinic adjacent formula. That is, they chose certain formula that would have likely been approved by the rabbis and not others that would not have been approved. And the bowls also can be used to help us better understand Talmudic legal debates and stories. And so we'd see the relationship now as a shared world rather than as separate worlds. And just to show you how we've done this, first, of course, the bowls, the discovery sites of the bowls and where the rabbis lived based on what the Talmud tells us were contiguous, right? These are exactly the same places. The bowls mention rabbis as clients, which is quite remarkable. They also invoke them as powerful historiolae and forces. We saw already to the right the name of Rabbi Joshua bar Parachia, who also appears in Syriac, but we also have the Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who also appears in the earliest rabbinic documents and on. Both of these appear in the bowls. We have other rabbis named in the bowls. These are only recently published. One is a rabbi named Acha bar Chanilai, who, quote unquote, according to this incantation bowl, opened up the heavens in Mata Mechasya. And I should note that this rabbi is only known from a very few, very short statements in the later layers of the Babylonian Talmud. And here, all of a sudden, he appears again with an additional story. Whatever this means, who opened up the heavens in Mata Mechasya, does that mean that he made it rain? Who knows? But there's some additional information about this rabbi, or at least the stories people were telling about him, that we can learn from the bowls. Notice again how rabbis are very important figures. It's not just individual rabbis. You also invoke the rabbis of Babylonia, the rabbis of the land of Israel, right? You can invoke them as a class to ward off malevolent forces. We have the earliest written example, evidence of the Mishnah, the earliest rabbinic compilation. We have citations of the Mishnah as kind of lump passage, citations of kind of a big lump of text from the Mishnah in the incantation bowls as a powerful invocation. I should note, unsurprisingly, at least in this case, the Mishnah that's cited is also recited in later early medieval liturgy. And so once again, like the Shema, it may have made its way to the incantation bowls, not by someone looking at the Mishnah per se, but kind of from its recitation in a liturgical context. And lastly, once we turn back to the Babylonian Talmud, with a different set of eyes, assuming a shared world and landscape, you begin to see that there are all sorts of stories that presume exactly the context in which the bowls are composed. For instance, this great story, which we don't have time to discuss in detail, in which there are demons in a bush. One rabbi comes along and tries to curse it, try to compose an incantation. The demons mock him because it's such a poor incantation, and another rabbi comes along and writes a better, more appropriate incantation, and the demons praise him and then run away. And so the point is, right, one of the things that differentiates good rabbis from bad rabbis or skilled rabbis from unskilled rabbis is not just their learning, but also in kind of Jewish knowledge, but also how to write an effective incantation. Okay, and then lastly, we're rethinking the study of ancient magic through things like the pseudo-script bowls, which I mentioned above. Remember, these bowls are oftentimes have imitation of script, but they don't spell out script. Sometimes they don't have script at all, but designs and patterns. And it used to be claimed that these were charlatans who exploited the general illiteracy of the population to sell them what were essentially knockoff incantation bowls. We now think that this is a particularly bad way of thinking about the pseudo-script bowls, especially because of things like this and other pattern bowls, which in no way resemble script and would not have tricked anybody, no matter how illiterate, they would be able to distinguish between those and quote unquote literate bowls. And so instead, we need to start thinking of this as a deliberate practice. Remember, incantations are ritual practice that is trying to harness the kind of powers around you through speech, through ritual acts. And perhaps there's something about the shapes, the colors, the placement, the activity around the placement, the sorcerer who brought it to you, the magician who brought it to you, and who maybe said something outside of what was written on the bowl that explain why these were considered powerful and attractive, given that they're, again, roughly 30% of all known bowls. Okay, so this has been a kind of speedy run through the brief history of the bowls, what incantations are, and how the bowls might help us better understand Jewish history. And I'll just quickly conclude by discussing what we did this past summer with the Penn Museum bowls. This began last summer with my collaborator and friend Rivka Eliezer-Lehman, and we're examining the roughly 200 unpublished bowls in the Penn collection. Remember, Montgomery only published 40 bowls. There are roughly 200 that remain. And part of what we did this summer is we asked, well, why didn't Montgomery look at these other bowls? Why didn't he publish these other bowls? And it turns out that he essentially made, it seems, two decisions for why he selected 40 bowls and excluded the rest. Some he excluded because they were simply illegible to his eyes or to our eyes, my eyes. If you look here, this is one bowl that's fairly illegible, right? It's faded and quite difficult to read. And the other reason is a literacy bias, basically the same assumption about the pseudo-script bowls. Anything that isn't good writing that's clearly legible is just kind of secondary interest and importance. And so our goal was, number one, let's find ways to decipher these faded bowls, and they're quite a large percentage of the collection are faded and difficult to read to the naked eye. We want to move past literacy bias and to understand what are the different ways in which incantation bowls reflect practices other than simply writing an incantation on the bowl. And then lastly, we want to make use of the fact that the Penn collection has a distinction of being one of the few collections in which we know exactly where and when the bowls were discovered. What might we be able to do with that knowledge? And so just to quickly show you examples of each of these, in terms of faded bowls, we've started to apply multimodal imaging with the help of the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials and the great people working there. And so here's the same bowl before that I said we couldn't read. And if you look to your right, you can make out far more of it than we could before. And just to show you, even the lines that were entirely illegible to our eyes, we can now read with the help of multimodal imaging. We're at the very beginnings of this. And to our knowledge, this hasn't really been attempted yet. And our goal is to see what else we might be able to accomplish with this and other kinds of scientific methods for deciphering these bowls. In terms of moving beyond these assumptions about charlatans, and instead we should think of scribes, we want to argue, as playing with literacy and design. For instance, we saw one fragment this summer that we couldn't read, but it clearly was writing, and it turns out that it's mirror or inverted script. They're kind of writing in the wrong direction and they're flipping words, but it's totally legible. Why a scribe might have done this rather than writing it from kind of right to left as you would expect is a good question, but certainly this reflects someone who could write and who made a decision to write in an inverted script. Similarly, we have bowls where scribes repeat consonants. If you look at these, they look like pseudoscript because you have the same consonant repeated too many times. But then when you look more carefully, it clearly spells out words. I'll just read this because you can understand what the practice here is. Amenin, amenin, en, sela, amen, amen, sela, hallelujah, amen, right? There's some kind of play here with consonants with duplication. And we found this on more than one bowl. So instead of dismissing these as kind of pseudoscript or charlatans, it seems more like there's some kind of a practice here. And then the last example, remember I said that there are cereal bowls and there are salad bowls. We found two bowls, which are clearly, even though highly fragmentary, salad bowls. They're massive relative to normal bowls. And yet they have tiny incantations on them, taking up only a tiny portion of the bowl. Both of these bowls were composed by the same scribe for the very same client. And it's, this image is for counteracting the Lilith and the demoness that she not approach Faroch bar Mashkoi. And so, of course, the question is, why did this person do this? It seems to be deliberate. It wasn't simply that this scribe only had a salad bowl available to them. It seems more likely, at least to us, that this person made a decision and that there's some play here in terms of the size of the bowl versus the relative kind of size of the incantation that maybe is meant to put more of the power on the bowl itself rather than the incantation, or perhaps there's some other relationship that we need to understand. Oh, and the last thing, and then I'll stop, is we also found these supposed pseudoscript bowls. Here we have 5 pseudoscript bowls, clearly duplications of each other by the same scribe, but each of them has a different client named explicitly on them. So this clearly isn't someone who cannot write or is illiterate and is a charlatan, because they made a decision to compose an identical bowl each time, but to deliberately change the name for the appropriate client. So again, let's move past the idea of pseudoscript as charlatans and ask, what are the variety of approaches and ritual practices that we see based on a kind of wider understanding of all the bowls in the Penn collection and related collections. Lastly, and then I really will conclude, in terms of provenance, we need to begin to look at the archives and understand where these things were found. These weren't just bowls that kind of appear in the ether. They were found in particular cities, in particular sites, in particular homes. What might we be able to tell about the urban landscape, about the environment in which they lived, based on where they were found? This is a highly localized archive. If you, instead of thinking of them as just incantation bowls, and you begin to collect them based on the scribes or the clients, you begin to realize that of the 2,500 that we discovered of these bowls, many of them are for the same clients by the same scribes. And so instead of thinking of them as kind of just a random collection, we need to really begin to tell also more local stories about particular clients, about particular scribes, their preferences, where they lived, and so on. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Simcha. There are 1 million questions, and as there should be, because there's a lot here, and it's so fun and so interesting and so surprising. I want to start with, obviously, the first and most important question is skulls and eggshells. Can you say more about that?
So there's in terms of skulls, there's a fantastic article by Dan Levine, which I'd be happy to share with anybody, where he deciphers what he can decipher of these 5 skulls in these various collections. There's one at Penn, there's a few in Berlin, and a few in another place. And you might think that they might be curse bowls or have kind of particular types of incantations, but they don't. They're mostly just protection bowls, and again, indistinguishable from the bowls themselves. And in the article, Dan tries to argue, I think plausibly, that perhaps there was some kind of particular force to the dead, to the kind of grave site. I should note that later medieval grimoires, magical recipe books, sometimes call for the use of bone and blood and so on in their incantations. So perhaps this is kind of an early use of that practice. Eggshells, often in medieval sources, those same grimoires, eggshells are prescribed for love magic pretty typically, and maybe there's some kind of procreation connection there.
Okay, so just following up on that, there's a whole set of questions that have to do, I think, further with how the bowls are used in practice. And some of the questions are like, is there evidence that there was stuff in the bowls? Did they put things in them? What kind of ink was used such that we can still read it? Were they written like on the spot with somebody watching? Like, I know that there's a lot of things that we can't know, but from what you do know, what can you say about the moment at which the bowl is put into use?
Just quickly about the stuff in them, the only thing to my knowledge that we found in them are eggshells, which are almost always broken, very few, but that's what we found in them. Early scholars in the 1850s and on thought that this was kind of a practice where a water practice where you put some kind of a liquid and you drink it out of the bowls. There's no evidence that that's the case, and that's why we now prefer the overturned demon trap. These are great questions that we're really thinking a lot about in terms of what is the performance that accompanied the incantations. Again, moving away from this literacy bias to thinking that the only thing that mattered was the incantation. There was a whole embodied experience that likely accompanied these incantation bowls. The problem is we have very few explicit descriptions of these practices. And so a lot of this is hypothetical and, surmising. I think one of the suggestions one might make are that pseudoscript bowls might reflect a practice where the weight is not on what's written, but on the performance. We might also think of this, another possible, again, hypothetical distinction. You might want a pseudoscript bowl as kind of pre-prepared when you have an urgent crisis. This would be something that you can run to a scribe and say, give me, I just need something. And the scribe or this magician would come, maybe recite the formula, which takes very little time, and then implant it in the home. Whereas the ones that are written out in very meticulous handwriting surely took some time and expertise. You might also argue some of these were more expensive and less expensive and so on. These are all sorts of different kind of discussions you might have. So the point is, there was undoubtedly performance that accompanied this at all of its stages. What that performance was remains, at least thus far, a mystery, but something that we think about quite extensively.
How much do you know about the scribes and the clients? Can you tell what position they were in society, how they related to each other? Were there women is one question that we've gotten. Like, what do you know?
So I'll rely on what other scholars have suggested. Abigail Mannequin-Bamberger, another collaborator and very good friend, she has suggested that one of the distinguishing features about the incantation bowls is the use of Jewish legal formulae, like the divorce formula, which oftentimes very closely resembles the actual divorce formula. And what she argues is that these are scribes who are scribes of both kind of, your divorce formula, your divorce contract, your marriage contract, your mezuzah, right? All these different types of scribal activities were performed by the same professional guild, as it were. This might explain why some scribal hands are better than others, why some prefer some kind of very learned formula and others less learned formula or more common formula. And so that's one way we've tried to understand the social position of these scribes. You might suggest some of them are rabbis, or people who were both in one class and another. Rabbis in rabbinic literature are often competing with magicians, but their identity is not clear and they're never described as writing an incantation bowl. So who these people are remains a mystery as well. In terms of women, this is women scribes. This is kind of a recent suggestion that's been made by quite a number of people at this point. I think in terms of, do we have evidence of women who are literate in antiquity and who engage in kind of scholastic scribal activity? We do. And so in terms of plausibility, it is plausible. In practice, I think I'm not convinced by the evidence that has been cited to try to argue that we actually can say that these were composed, at least some of them, by women. I don't see any evidence to suggest that that's the case. And so I think we just go back to probability. And the probability is that most, if not all of them, were composed by men, though I think we can be open to, some marginal cases which are otherwise. Okay,
so in the like 1 minute and 30 seconds that remain, I think it actually follows nicely in what you were just saying. There are a lot of questions about the relationship to the worldview of the rabbis, the relationship between magic and liturgy, or incantation and liturgy, this sort of thing. I think maybe we can't cover all that right now. I think there's a ton to be said about incorporating the magical or the demonic into what we understand the rabbis to be doing, right? But there are some more specific questions, I think, about whether there's like basically how we're seeing this as a cross section of something Jewish or rabbinic and something local, right? And you gestured that to the beginning. So is there evidence of other local Babylonian, ancient Iraqi practices that are similar to this, that somehow Jews are sort of taking up or incorporating? Or how does that intersection work, if you can do it in a minute?
So the very brief version of this, I would say, is that one of the main scholarly paradigm shifts in the past few decades, even more recent than that, is that we now think the rabbis are likely rather marginal in late antiquity and become increasingly more prominent over the course of the early Middle Ages. And as a result, there's no question that the bowls do not collectively represent rabbinic authority or the acknowledgement of rabbinic authority. And instead, we need to be more particular and exact in describing what is the kind of rabbinic evidence that appears broadly across incantation bowls, like Rabbi Joshua ben Parachia is pretty prominent across bowls, but then also focus in on particular scribes and clients who seem to have been particularly attracted to rabbinic formulae and figures. And this is the article I alluded to earlier that Abigail and I wrote, where we basically try to do this. And we argue that we can identify some scribal hands that seem to have been more obviously socialized in rabbinic norms than other scribes. There are all sorts of, in all the bowls and throughout every one of them, there is a ton of Babylonian deities, Babylonian figures that reflect some kind of retention from the ancient Near Eastern past. And that were still ongoing and living throughout late antiquity.
So instead of a model where we're thinking like the rabbinic scene and the rabbis were like normal Jewish and these were these weird magic stuff, actually it's more like magic and demons was sort of the normal and rabbis were marginal and sort of growing in influence over time.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, amazing. I want to thank you so much. I'm sorry, we could talk for another half an hour or longer. I want to thank everybody for coming. And I also want to point out that Simcha mentioned at one point in passing that we have these tablets from the earlier period of Jews in Babylonia called the Marashu Archive. And those are the materials that are going to be talked about in the program that we have a month from now, featuring Professor Lori Pierce, talking about how those tablets can be used as evidence of Jews in Babylonia at that time. So please join us for that. I also want to say to everyone, the video will be posted within about a week's time to YouTube. So if it moved fast and you want to get the details again, you can re-watch there. And I hope to see you all back here again. Thank you so much, Simcha.